We are moving into the second chapter of Animals, which is the third section of the book. And we're going to cover two groups that are not that closely related but have a lot of things in common. A real base of the pyramid kind of animals. The sponges and the Cnidarians, previously called the Coelenterids. That's one of those deals where they got the name changed. Coelenterid just means has a space inside, and they thought that was a pretty vague name for a phylum. So they went with Cnidaria, which is basically stingers. You'll see why when we get to them. This is when jellyfish travel at unsafe speeds. Jellyfish are in the Cnidaria. We'll start with the sponges. Now, sponges in a lot of taxonomic classification systems are considered to be in their own separate kingdom. There's a decent amount of indication that they don't share a common ancestor with the animals in the animal kingdom, but there's always debate about that. And that's part of what separates one group from another. They should share an ancestor in the same group in order to be considered in the same group. Sponges are also pretty weird on a number of levels. There are some sponges where you could take the sponge out of a saltwater tank, put it in a blender, put the blender on just the right setting to pull the sponge completely apart without killing the cells, or without killing most of the cells. And then you wind up with a sponge smoothie, I guess. If you were to pour it back into your saltwater tank, a week later, the sponge would be there again. So the cells would find each other and reform the sponge. They can't live on their own indefinitely, but they can live on their own long enough to do that. So they are one step closer to multicellular from colonies, but they've got this weird ability to survive just long enough to reassemble. Not all sponges can do that, but the fact that any sponges can do that is kind of interesting. So I'm going to write some stuff down. There's some terms that don't just apply to sponges, but this is the first place that we'll see it. So this is when we get some of these some of the language out of the way. Find the right pen. A lot of times, I'm not going to expect you to know the technical name of the group. The sponges of Porifera is the name of the kingdom or phylum, subkingdom in some classification systems. But we'll call them sponges. Cnidaria, we got to call them Cnidaria because there really isn't any other kind of regular English name for them. Sponges as a group are sessile. What the heck does that mean? It means that they don't move. Is that they sit in one place. Now, some things that are sessile can move if they have to. Sponges really can't. Sponges, once your sponge forms in a particular place, it's pretty much stuck there. And they're, the only kind of movement they do is to release eggs and sperm into the environment. So they don't spread too quickly across the environment. There's two cell layers, ectoderm and endoderm. We've got ectoderm and endoderm, an outer layer and an inner layer. The inner layer, you've got this outer covering, this ectoderm, and this inner covering with these funny little cells on it. Technically called choanocytes. That's why that's what was on the other picture. Here it's called the collar cell. This is the cell that's embedded in the inner layer, the endoderm. This looks like a sheet, but it's actually a whole bunch of fine projections, like a plastic cone that somebody had curled into a circle. They're very close together. Sticking up through the middle is a flagellum. The flagellum moves, and it moves water down, and the water it hits the top of the cell and goes out through the comb, excuse me. Now, the membrane on the comb is sticky and movable, and it can catch particles that are on the comb and move them down to the surface of the cell, where they're kind of tasted. And if they're food particles, as opposed to just, sand or dust particles, then the cell will engulf the food, take it inside and digest it, and then share the food with the rest of the cells that aren't feeding. So they are filtering food out of the water. And that's what filter feeders do. They filter food out of the water. It's generally only applied to the water. Personally, I think an orb weaver spider is a filter feeder too, because they filter stuff out of the air, but they're not considered filter feeders. But filter feeders include the very smallest of the animals up to the very largest of the animals. The blue whales are filter feeders. The particles that blue whales catch are like this size. They're not really particles, but they're still filtering them out of the water. The epidermal cell, the cells on the outside, don't look all that different from our epidermal cells. The cells that we looked at in the microscope lab that came off the inside of our cheeks pretty much look like that, and so did these guys. They pull water comes in from the outside, gets filtered, sometimes on the way in, sometimes inside the chamber. Sometimes these are really complicated, sometimes they're not. Between the outer layer and the inner layer is a layer of has a jelly-ish material. It's not cellular, but it's like a jelly. Now there are cells in there. There are cells that wander around like amoebas, and they are replacement cells. If a scratch happens on the ectoderm and some of the cells scrape off, amoeboid cells will crawl into that spot and turn on certain genes and become epidermal cells. If collar cells die, then they'll drop off, and an amoeboid cell will move into that position and become a collar cell. So the idea of having all of your genes in all of your cells kind of starts here, because the replacement cells have to be pretty much everything. That isn't the only way to put a multi-celled system together. There's some kind of bizarre multi-celled systems where as the cells go through like an embryonic period, not all of the genes go with every division, and you wind up with a population of cells that only have the genes for that population of cells that only have the genes for that population. It is possible to build an animal that way, but that's very unusual. Most of them are kind of starting from this idea where every cell has at least the genetic potential to do all of the jobs. Now, what's also inside a sponge is a material that's stiff that gives the sponge its structure, and these are called spicules. This is a sponge. You can see the pores. This is a sponge where the spicules are made of a protein. Here's a slightly stiffer one where it's made from a, now this may be silica. This is a flexible protein. Classic old sponges. Used to be living sponges that they took and dried out, and then they would sell them. And this is what used to be a commercial sponge. So they also produce sponges with calcium carbonate, the material in our bones. So you've got calcium-based group, a silica-based group. The spicules there are like little sharp pieces of glass. These guys don't get eaten by too many things, so it's pretty good defense. And then the protein-based group. And there's some slop over where some of them do combinations, but that's your basic divisions of the sponges, is what sort of spicules do they make. Only they know the difference. The jellyfish in some of the Cnidaria are the sexually reproducing structures. They're mobile, they can find each other. There are males and females. You can't really look at them and tell. If you looked really, really closely and could tell whether they're making sperm cells or egg cells, that's pretty much the only way you would be able to tell whether you were looking at a male jellyfish or a female jellyfish. For most medusae, that term will come up in a couple of minutes. But that's the second group inside this chapter, and that is the Cnidaria. Your basic body form of the Cnidaria. Again, 2 layers of cells, an ectoderm and an endoderm. The endoderm lines what's called the gastrovascular cavity. I'll write this stuff down eventually. Gastro, because the hollow actually extends inside all the different parts of the body. So, and the digestive, they break food down in there, and the broken down particles can get everywhere because the animal's hollow, and so it distributes the food through the spaces. These are your 2 basic body forms, one with the tentacles and the mouth on the top, the other one with the tentacles and the mouth on the bottom. This is a sessile form. It sits and doesn't move. At the most, it can do like little cartwheels and move a little bit. And this is the jellyfish form. It pulses and can swim. So you've got a sessile form and a mobile form. Now, in the whole group, there's some subgroups of the Cnidaria that only are this form, and some subgroups that only are that form. And then there are groups that go back and forth. So they do have a number of things in common with the sponges. They do have an ectoderm, they have an endoderm, they have jelly, they have amoeboid cells. They have muscle cells, they're not supposed to have actual muscles. They have nerve cells. They don't actually have a brain. But they do respond to things, and in some cases they can respond in a fairly subtle way. And the nerve system is set up in a way unlike other animals, where in all other animals, your nerve system, the nerve cells are like railroad tracks. But a railroad track, you could run a train either way. But animal systems are set up so there's tracks that take stuff out and there's tracks that bring stuff in. In Cnidaria, there are tracks where the trains can go in both directions. They just have to make sure they're out of each other's way. But they can take messages out to the muscles. They can take messages in from the sensory cells in the surface. The endoderm is digestive. When it's breaking food down, if the particles get small enough, they will engulf particles and digest them inside the cells, similar to what the sponges do, but they also digest by dumping digestive enzymes into the space and breaking stuff down. So they'll take whole animals in, and they will gradually break them down and distribute them, the vascular part of gastrovascular. They have stinging cells. Cells embedded in the ectoderm that have like a cable and a stinger on them, have a little trap door, and they can squirt these things out. Sometimes they're very long, sometimes they're just short, but they have barbs on them. And so something touches them, they're kind of tasting, because they're not going to react to just anything that touches them. But something that's potentially another living thing, and they go pew, and they shoot these little barbs out, and they're connected to a poison blob that will squirt poison out, so they can paralyze the things that they sting. And that's the name where the name of the group comes from. These are Nitocites. This is a kind of an old Latin word for barb or spike. And this is a characteristic of the whole group. So jellyfish and hydras and sea anemones and corals, these are all in this group. I'll list those in a second. All belong, they all have these stinging cells. Sometimes the stinging cells are quite small and you can't really feel them. In some of the groups, like the corals, they go through alternation of generations. The polyp form can't move, it's sessile. It can make more polyps though, asexually. So coral can spread across an area, and they're all clones of one another. And a lot of times they're all connected to each other still. They may not all be doing the same jobs. Some of the polyps may be feeding polyps, some of them may be defensive polyps, some of them may be reproductive polyps. They can produce medusae, the little jellyfish, that are also clones of the original polyp. They're asexually produced, but they are capable of reproducing sexually. And they're also capable of getting up into the surface and spreading with the currents and reproducing and dropping larvae where there may be a new island and a new place to form a coral colony. So these are much better at distributing themselves across wide swaths of ocean than say a sponge can. So we've got corals, hydra, which we're going to look at in the lab. Anemones, Nemo is a clownfish. They live in anemones. They have a coating on the fish that the anemones taste and don't recognize as being something to sting, so they can live in the anemones and not get stung. You can actually take a clownfish and scrape it and put it in, and they'll die because the anemones will sting them. The anemones are permanent polyp form. They don't spread as much. And if you're looking in the water in the ocean and you see an anemone or a jellyfish about this size or bigger, it is not going, it's not a medusa. It's not a sexually reproducing form. It's the whole subgroup is built like that. They're all jellyfish, and the big ones, definitely. And then a weird member. Portuguese man of war forms it has a float on it. A shiny blue, very pretty float that somebody at some point thought looked like the sail on a Portuguese man of war. That's where the name comes from. Hanging underneath, there's a colony of members, but some of the members have very long tentacles that hang down, sometimes as much as 100 feet. And anything that swims into the tentacles can get stung, and then some of the tentacles will bring it up to the surface where it gets digested. Now these guys, the jellyfish and the Portuguese man of war, can be dangerous, sometimes the corals too if you step on them, because some of them, the stingers are powerful enough to penetrate humans. There's a couple of species of jellyfish that are in and of themselves toxic enough to kill a human being. Most of them are not even powerful enough to paralyze a human being. If you're swimming and you get stung by them, you're probably not going to get paralyzed. But some people, if they're around them a lot, they get stung a lot, they develop allergies to it. They can die from anaphylactic shock from being exposed to the sting. And of course, if you were swimming along and you swam into a Portuguese man of war and got covered in these stinging tentacles, or into a group of jellyfish and they were all stinging you, people panic and drown. So these guys can kill people. They rarely do it directly through their poison, but they do very often produce either allergic reactions or panic and drown the people. So they can be dangerous. Portuguese men of war sometimes get washed up on beaches, and then the beaches have to be closed. You'll see these little floats that are kind of like balloons losing their air. But the thing is that also on the beach, on the sand, these tentacles are spread all over the place, and until they die, they will sting the bottom of your foot if you step on them, or if you sit on the sand, you get stung on them. And the classic first aid on the spot is urine, is that there is a protein in urine that helps to mitigate the pain a little bit. So it's not an old wives' tale. It doesn't really make the pain go away completely, but it helps a little. If you can get somebody to pee on you, or you pee on yourself. I suppose on your foot you might be able to do it on yourself. But there's better treatments than that. Best treatment is not to go on the beach when the beach is closed. For Portuguese men of war, I haven't been thrown up on the beach. Okay, that is that particular chapter.